Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to Islamic at Authors. I'm Usaama al-Azami of the University of Oxford, and it really gives me an immense pleasure to invite my dear friend and colleague and a brother from another mother, Dr. Asim Qureshi, who is a well-known sort of community activist in our and an academic, of course, in the British Muslim community, and is a prolific author who, of his sort of 3 books, 2 books and 1 edited volume, I'll only be discussing. Unfortunately, we only have the time to discuss one of those books, and I hope, inshallah, that Asim Bhai, you'll be sort of coming and joining me at some other point in the future to discuss your other work as well. So just a brief introduction to Asim Qureshi, to his book, which he will, inshallah, begin by introducing in a moment. And just to introduce who Dr. Asim Qureshi is, he's a graduate of law. He did an LLB and an LLM before pursuing a PhD in international conflict analysis, and is currently research director of the advocacy organization CAGE, where he's been based since 2004. He's, as I mentioned, the author of a number of works. His first book, I believe, was 2009, Rules of Engagement, Detention, Deportation and Disappearance, published by Hearst and Columbia University Press. And he's recently also published, as an edited volume with a collection of academics, I Refuse to Condemn, a fascinating work which I look forward to having the opportunity to read and discuss with yourself, inshallah, at some point in the future. And what we're talking about today is his 2019 edition of A Virtue of Disobedience. Really a sort of a fascinating meditation, and in some respects a manual as well for us, for those of us who are in the activist space, to think about how to engage with sort of the challenges that are faced by all sorts of groups facing injustice. And so in that sort of connection, I'd love to let yourself, Asim Bhai, to introduce your book. Just sort of a comment on format. We start with 10 to 15 minutes where the author speaks about their book, and then I usually launch into a kind of dialogue and conversation, bringing my own questions, which can go on for half an hour, can go on even longer. It really depends on how much time you have, and you have expressed your generous willingness to go on as late as 8 o'clock, but inshallah no longer than that. And so, audience members can also actually ask your questions. They'll come up in our comment section, and we'll be looking to them, inshallah, towards the end of the hour. We'll begin to address those questions as well. So there can be the opportunity of dialogue. This is a wonderful opportunity to ask Dr. Asim Qureshi your questions. And finally, I'd want to highlight to everyone that you can buy the book. I've given a link, with both the Facebook post and the YouTube sort of description, depending on the outlet you're watching on, and on Twitter. I'm not sure exactly how you might be able to get that link. I don't think it's there. And please feel free to like, follow and subscribe my sort of various outlets for future sessions, inshallah. But without further ado, Asim Bhai, if you don't mind, please introduce the book.
Assalamu alaikum to you, obviously, Dr. Usaama. It's such a pleasure to be here, and to, knowing the stellar cast of individuals you've already had in these discussions. It's a real honor for me to be considered worthy of being in this one as well. So Virtue of Disobedience really came out of a sabbatical year that I was taking from CAGE. I had been, by that stage, involved with kind of activist work for about 15 years. And I felt like at the start of 2017, I needed a break, not a break from activism as such, but a break to take stock of, of just anything and everything, really, whether it's my kind of spiritual life, whether it's my intellectual life, whatever it might be, to just, take a back seat. I mean, I was still involved with various things, but alhamdulillah, the team at CAGE, they gave me the space that I needed. And really what I did was kind of do what I normally do, which is read, but just read at maybe an unprecedented level, even for myself. And yeah, coming into Ramadan of that year, I had no intentions to write. I was really more writing notes to myself as I was reading. I was just journaling that year. I was just thinking about things a lot. And what happened at the start of Ramadan is a Jummah khutbah, where, and my children, they go to Jummah with me. And we were sitting there, we were listening to this Jummah take place, and this Syrian Imam, he was speaking about protesting, and how as Muslims it was haram for us to protest. And he said that this was an act that was akin to kufr, that it was an act of disbelief to do so. And to put it in some context, at this stage you have like perhaps the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, you know, in terms of the sheer volume of killings that are taking place, that are being witnessed as a public spectacle within the public eye and on social media. People are able to capture what's happening by police officers much more easily. And so there was, you know, a great deal of conversation around kind of protesting and whether or not Muslims should be involved in this protesting. And, you know, he eventually came to the conclusion that to protest against the police was also an act of kufr, to even complain about their behavior, because he said that they were agents of the state, and therefore protesting against them was an act of rebellion. It was an act of baghi. And I know your forthcoming book, Dr. Usaama, which I've had the pleasure of reading, you know, really does go into this in some detail.
Exactly.
I think people will benefit a great deal from that book when it comes out, in terms of thinking about it from the perspective of the Middle East in particular. But you know, at that time, I felt a great deal of anger inside myself that I was listening. I don't want to set a bad precedent for my children in relation to the khutbah, so I kind of held everything that I felt inside me in that moment and kind of stayed in my seat, even though I saw somebody actually get up and leave the Jummah, which, you know, there was a lot of anger in the room as he was speaking. People weren't happy about what he was saying. But I stayed in my seat, more for my children than anything else. But when I got to the car, it was the first time I'd had a conversation, because up until that point, I'd always taught them that in any environment where they're in, where somebody has a duty of care towards them, whether it's a parent, an uncle, an aunt, or a grandparent, you know, a kind of friend of the family, uncle or aunt, or a teacher, or their Quran teacher, whoever it might be, they are effectively in their mother's position while they are under that care, and therefore the obedience that we expect from them is the same obedience that we expect for ourselves, right? That's what we teach them. And this was the first time where, you know, having taught them that you are supposed to respect the Imam, you're supposed to respect what he says, like people of scholarship, you're supposed to respect and admire them even, that I had to sit them down and say, look, our scholars don't always get everything right. And that was a very difficult conversation for me, and it was a very painful conversation for me to have with them, because I don't want them to feel that way. I don't want them to feel that that these kind of figures that we want to hold out to as being exemplars for all of us within the community, that somehow at such an early age that they understand that they're fallible. Of course, that's going to come with time, right? Like, as we all come to understand, because none of us are the Prophet ﷺ, right? But I just felt at that moment that it was necessary to clear up some of the confusion that they would have felt, because we talk about what's going on in the world in our house. Like, they know about protesting, and
Right.
so there were questions that they had about what they were hearing. So that's really that's what motivated the book. And I actually wrote the book over the course of the Ramadan, like every night after Qiyam until Fajr time, I was just kind of writing, because I found it the most kind of peaceful part of the day to be able to do that.
Right.
And
You wrote
just
the
turned
entire
into-
book in Ramadan.
Yeah, that's right.
Subhanallah.
Yeah. As in like a
That's
first
a very,
draft of
very-
it, at least anyway.
Right.
Yeah. So
Subhanallah.
I think a lot of the ideas were already there, and because I digitize, you know, and tag, and I have a whole method of how I read books and how I keep information. When I came to writing, the writing became very fluid for me.
Right.
and so alhamdulillah, like I was able to do that over the course of the month. But I only really started out, I was journaling to myself. I was just writing for myself initially, and then what was journaling became a kind of more of a philosophical meditation on activism, on the relationship between our spirit and the world that we see. You know, I say in the introduction that I don't want to have this feeling where I clock into the masjid for my spiritual life and then clock out for the worldly life. That there has to be something that connects the spiritual with what's happening in the world. It's
Right.
like kind of part of a
Right.
circulatory system.
Right.
And so yeah, that's really where the book came from. This understanding that in my reading of the Quran at least, that there was an element of disobedience towards kufr, towards shirk, towards dhulm, that was laudatory, was virtuous, and that's something that I wanted to really think about in relation to the various aspects of the world that I saw in my activist life in particular. So it kind of, the book's kind of written as a meditation to myself. I'm trying to really speak to myself more so than, you know, setting out in strict terms like, you know, a guidance document. It's more about,
Right.
okay,
Right.
here's how I'm feeling about X, Y, or Z. So it's really written as a conversation with myself and with others.
Right. I noticed in the sort of endorsements from scholars from around the world, of course, Yasser Morsi comments how, in a sense, there's something analogous to his own autoethnography that he wrote as his doctorate, that there's this kind of personal reflection. And I've read Yasser's wonderful book, actually. I mean, it's really, it's wonderful, but it's very painful in many respects, because it's this meditation over the gross injustices that encapsulate, being a Muslim in the West in many respects is a microcosm of. But that it really sort of, I reread the book today, and I'd read it quite a while ago when you kindly shared it with me. And, it is something which we need more of, in the sense that I think there's a lot of activism out there. It's not necessarily integrated in the way that you do with our spirituality, with our religion, embedded within Quranic sort of narratives and stories, teachings. And I found that personally very valuable. And hopefully, inshallah, over the course of this discussion, we will have the opportunity to sort of discuss that further. I did want to just comment on a couple of things you mentioned. So you were talking about the difficulty of, and perhaps get your advice on this as well, like the difficulty of referring or teaching your children about the fact that scholars are people who you have a great deal of respect for, but they're not perfect human beings. They can make mistakes. And, I have two boys of my own, and they're very young, but they're not at the age where we can have that kind of discursive relationship yet. But I wonder, just curious how old your boys were, and, when you would normally have expected to talk about this kind of, the fallibility of human beings, that those who you respect and esteem as authority figures, no one's perfect except the Prophet.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
My eldest, who was the primary target of my discussion, was 9 at the time. And, he kind of knows about what's going on in the world, because we have this weekly magazine we subscribe to called The Week Junior. So, it's kind of a very liberal-minded magazine for children. It's written for that age group, but it really makes them aware about a whole range of issues that are going on in the world. It's a news magazine. It has comment pieces. It has some analysis as well. Most of which is really really excellent. In fact, and he'll come and talk to us about what he's reading, and it was just a really great way of. And so he was already aware of what was going on with the Black Lives Matter movement before any of this was happening, and so I didn't actually even need to, I guess, prompt that discussion in the car, because I knew it was something that he would have been thinking about, because that's what the khutbah was ostensibly targeting.
Right.
So we're a family of readers, alhamdulillah. Like my kids, they kind of constantly engaging with various materials in different ways. And so it was just at that time it felt like it was a conversation that I could have with him. I don't think I would have had that conversation otherwise until he's the age that he's at right now, which is like 13. So
Right.
if it did feel like it came a bit earlier than it should have. You want
Yes,
them
I
to
mean,
keep their innocence for
absolutely,
as long as possible
absolutely.
as parents, right?
I mean, yes, in a sense, you want to create a bit of a protective bubble around them, but at the same time, as you say, like once they come of age, they will be it sounds like you're doing, if I may say so, doing a wonderful job in keeping them informed about the world, so that they can, inshallah, think about what sort of role do they want to have in the long term, as they grow up, as they become fully participating members, citizens of our country, and
that kind of things are impossible to know.
yeah, I mean, it's something which we aspire to, of course. And the other sort of, you made this as a tangential comment, but I found it fascinating that you were saying, I didn't want, I don't want to sort of check out of my spiritual life when I come into the world, and I don't want to check out of my worldly life when I go into the mosque. And this is, of course, the sort of archetypal kind of modern condition, the sort of secularization of the world, the assumption that actually, yes, religion is a private affair. And I think this is something which, there are a number of scholars who are writing about this, talking about this these days. I think of someone like al-Asad, and it kind of bleeds into sort of like Islam and politics literature as well. I teach a course on Islam and politics to postgraduate students, and I teach Peter Mandeville's book called Islam and Politics. I've not been very creative with my own sort of course title. And, he very illuminatingly suggests early on that, this, drawing on Talal al-Assad, this assumption that religion and politics are supposed to be separate from each other is a distinctly sort of modern European sort of expression of what it is to be a citizen and so on. So, I think there's, in many respects, we can enrich, I think, the conceptual worlds of our co-citizens, non-Muslim co-citizens very often, who may have that perspective, to help them reflect actually religion can be a force for justice rather than the stereotypical assumption that religion is a cause for problems.
No, I think it's just interesting because even the notion that they're secular is something that we need to contest more strongly, because they have an underlying ideology that they're still subscribing to in order to then have a vehicle to carry themselves, right? So, for example, it could be nationalism as like a myth that they have to give themselves, that ties them together, so that they have some kind of moral consistency in how they operate. Because really, like, other than the fact of some massive geographical lottery of evolutionary life in their perspective, right? Like, what is so great about ultimately being British or French or German, wherever you might be, right? Like, there's nothing there that would morally bind you to that notion, other than that you have chosen an ideological frame to give yourself something to tie a notion of that morality too. And so, like, this whole idea of even secularism is for me such a bizarre one, because they're not secular in any sense of the meaning, really.
This is, I mean, I'm going to sort of segue using this into plugging an idea that I've been having for a while, and hopefully I plan to write actually a book, hopefully called The Myth of Secularism, that precisely looks at this. And this is, in some respects, it's not necessarily a particularly original insight of mine, but Émile Durkheim, the great French sociologist, has a functionalist conception of what a religion is, and he basically says all human societies by default need religion, and so every human society is religious by default. They've emptied out this sort of space that Christianity may have occupied in the past, but it's been replaced with nationalism, as he said. And he doesn't actually define religion in relation to God per se, which I think is quite Ibn Taymiyyah fascinatingly has a conception of religion which is very similar to that. He basically says religion. He has a book called Quietest al-Mahabba, where he basically argues. I'm drawing on the work of Ahmed Shamsi, where I should give credit where credit is due. It's unpublished so far, but he basically says a religion is the shared ideas and sentiments of a community that are geared towards a unifying kind of normative system. Roughly, I'm translating it. Secularism is that, right? I mean, or liberalism is that. And I don't know if you've read, you read a lot, so I have no doubt you have actually read this probably. William Cavanagh's The Myth of Religious Violence.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I think you'll love this book. It's about a decade old now, but Kavanagh, who I hope maybe in a future episode I'll be able to interview him on that book. Basically, explores the question of what is a religion, and I don't entirely agree with his sort of conclusion to that question, but he basically says religion as a category in the modern West was kind of invented in order to be a foil to the secular. This is kind of drawing on Assad and others, so that secular violence could be legitimated, secular imperialism could be legitimated, and it could be said that religion is violent. We're here to rescue you from that violence. Whereas the actual violence perpetrated by the secular, anyone who sort of has just a cursory reflection on, will recognize that actually, the 20th century is the most bloody century in the history of humanity, and overwhelmingly that wasn't committed in the name of religion. It was committed in the name of secular ideologies, post-Enlightenment ideologies. And so, he quotes, again, it's nothing new under the sun, so to speak, and you quote that line in your book as well. He quotes a great historian from Columbia University from the last century who wrote a book called Nationalism, a Religion. And his essay from 1926, again, if you can Google Carlton Hayes, Hayes, Nationalism, and the essay's up on the internet. And it's just very striking how much you can make that argument that you've just made, that nationalism is very much a religion. When Nathan Hale, the sort of, I think it's I don't know if he's a real person, I don't know American history well enough, but he's kind of like the unknown soldier or something like this. But Nathan Hale is this figure who is, it's attributed to him, he said, my only sort of regret is that I can only give my life for my country just once, right? And, Kavanagh argues that, well, if you define religion as ultimate concern, his country is his ultimate concern there, right? So in any case, I mean, it's I think that's, sorry, this is supposed to be me asking you about your book, so let me go ahead.
Happy to keep this as a conversation.
Jazakumullah khairan. I mean, it's just been wonderful reading your book all day, to be honest, rereading your book. I wanted to sort of actually start with something which some people might find a little unusual in the activist space, but I like, and I think you're doing this very consciously, you, in some respects, consciously highlight female voices as a sort of, or perhaps it's not done terribly consciously, but as activists as well. So the dedication of the book is to a lady who was, as I understand, a legal expert assisting with Guantanamo Bay cases, if I recall correctly. So Charlotte
Death
Holdman.
penalty cases, yeah.
Death penalty cases, sorry.
Guantanamo was just one, but yeah.
Right. You you commissioned a poem of Suhaima Manzoor. I forget her full name. Sorry, Suhaima Manzoor Khan.
Manzoor Khan. Mm-hmm.
Manzoor Khan, and also a foreword written by Anne Norton. And you comment at some point that a lot of women have engaged in sort of standing up for justice, but in not acknowledged. And I wonder. I mean, you do comment at a certain point that there are certain challenges that also, arise for women in particular. And I was at least as I recall, and I wonder to what extent that's to do with sort of, how the Muslim community might see something like this, but also the fact that women suffer a kind of triple penalty, as they say, of being Muslim, of being women, and of being usually in these sorts of contexts people who are minority ethnic. So yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting one because, as somebody who doesn't have any sisters and no daughters, I've had a relatively speaking, less of a footprint in terms of lives of women in my life than maybe some other people have. in a very personal way. Obviously, I have a mother, alhamdulillah, and actually, my mother is a very, very strong source of inspiration. I always tell people that there was nobody who's, after Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's nobody who saved me from myself as much as my mother did, especially in my youth, right? If there was somebody who did her very best to save me from the worst excesses of my own self, it's definitely my mother. Alhamdulillah, my wife is a very, very important influence in my life too right now, and has been since we've been married now almost 14 years, alhamdulillah. But yeah, I mean, and just throughout my whole career, even the first executive director of Cage, when I joined, she was a sister, she led the organization, just a brilliant activist, somebody who dedicated so much of her life and still continues to do so to the causes of Muslims who are suffering, a great personal cost to herself. So she was a huge influence in terms of having somebody who I could look up to in terms of a work ethic. To the extent it was probably a little bit unhealthy for all of us to have a work ethic like that in those days. But like with any kind of grassroots organization, when it starts off, it requires
huge sacrifices
of time, and she embodied that entirely. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless her and everything that she does. And my mentor, Dr. Charlotte Holman, subhanAllah, she taught me so much about how to investigate, about how to interview, about trauma, about many different topics and many ways of seeing and thinking. And it was one of the greatest blessings of my life when she rang me and my wife to inform us that she had accepted Islam. And this wasn't out of any kind of active process, but she said that watching my wife and the way that my wife was with her guests and with her family and with her children really convinced her that this is what religion was supposed to be. And that was quite a remarkable thing from a woman who had always said that she would never accept any religion because of some very difficult experiences that she had personally in her life. So yeah, that was a huge blessing for me to have her, to have been taught by her. And so yeah, I guess I had a number of very important influences in my life. But also the activist scene is one that's so dominated by sisters, and they make huge sacrifices. And even myself, I have to admit that I don't do a good enough job of accepting that, or not accepting it, of really giving it its due regard.
Right.
And and I think maybe I'm a little bit different from other people in the sense that I don't see anybody as having a set role as such in my personal view. I see all of us as having been given rizq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's very, very specific, and you're only held accountable for that rizq that you've been given. And I can't square how Allah would allow for a circumstance to emerge where somebody would become, say for example, particularly educated or particularly well versed or have expertise in a specific area, and their sole job is to sit at home and not use any of those skills and knowledge that they've acquired. If you think of characters like Amara from the time of the Prophet ﷺ, you're going to withhold somebody from the battlefield just because she's a woman? No, the Prophet ﷺ didn't.
Fascinating.
He included her in his forces. So yeah, it's just I guess maybe a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are cultural dimensions to this, and there are also certain kind of around the world, whether in pre-modern times or in modern times, overwhelmingly military engagements are conducted by men. But at the same time, you have these talented individuals who can contribute in so many different ways. The literature on Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar, and the the best work on this is one of my teachers, the academic Michael Cook, who wrote Commanding Right and Forbidding Wrong. It's a encyclopedic work, and he has this massive section on Ghazali, which really is almost a small book unto itself. And he and I don't think this is unique to Ghazali, but Ghazali points out that Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is an obligation on everyone, men, women. In that context, he's speaking about free and slaves, free people and slave. A slave can go to their master and say, "You are doing this wrong," right? I mean, so even there, it's a very different conception of what slavery is, because ultimately everyone's a slave to God, in the Islamic conception. So in that regard, everyone is equal, and a slave, socially speaking, who is dispossessed, is still able to, hold the hold to account those who are in power. And even a figure like Ghazali, hopefully this is a theme that we'll have the opportunity to discuss in great detail, the religious dimension of this issue, and the you actually began the conversation by talking about this khutbah, so perhaps this is as good an opportune a moment to discuss this as any, that the Ghazali, who's this great Sufi figure in Islamic history, is someone who celebrates in his Ihya Ulumuddin, his great Sufi work. Perhaps, if it's all right, I'm keen to quote some things from your book, which sort of struck me in many respects in talking about this religious dimension. You say that, you have that quote from the khutbah, "Even if he oppresses you, you should not protest against it." The Arab Spring, right? So this is the quote you have in the book. For me, as far as I'm concerned, and this is something I want to go into in great detail, but let me start with this. In my view, Islam is quite a remarkable resource for the activist, for seeking justice. And I've just quoted one of the great authorities of Islam, who's obviously building on verses from the Quran and hadiths about things like Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahi anil Munkar, which you can sort of perhaps elaborate in your response. And I just wanted to sort of explore with you why religion goes in this direction sometimes, rather than going in the direction of acquiescing to tyranny, or even supporting tyranny implicitly, rather than going in the direction of holding tyranny to account.
Yeah, that's the ultimate question. I think that's where the contestation really that we see so much of taking place in the social media space in particular is really revolving around. Ultimately, what are we protesting against? For what purpose? And it's interesting that the accusation of being concerned with material things is used by both sides. So the Quietists, for want of a better term, even though I think that's inaccurate, what they say is that the people who are worried about social justice are worried about the material world, right? Like, you should just concentrate on your spiritual state and not worry about what's going on in the material world. But ironically, the same accusation is thrown back at the Quietists, because the idea that they're worried about their personal safety and like their the sanctity of their life over dealing with an injustice is a material argument. Ultimately, you're placing your own life, which of course we know is permitted, above that of a greater, or we should say a greater injustice that's taking place.
Right.
And so you end up in this quandary now, right? Whose material is more material, less material than the others, right?
Right.
Because
right.
really they in some ways I would suggest that in my book that I think that the Quietists, they privilege certain ideas that came through the history of Islam, through scholarship, over the fundamental messages of the Quran. That in fact they don't use the Quran itself in their argumentation, because the Quran, and that's what I'm suggesting in the book, points to that when you're facing a large injustice, that your own personal safety and sanctity has nothing to do with success in an afterworld sense. And that's why I kind of give examples of the people killed by the people of the ditch, and kind of many others, that and like the magicians of Fir'aun and so on and so forth. Like, there is just like this endless stream of examples of people who place their own personal safety at risk for the sake of And in some cases, for very, very, very kind of small things that they're saying, like nothing even necessarily to do with like the mass slaughter, the mass killing, or the mass imprisonment of people. Like in some cases,
Right.
literally just saying a word,
Right.
And they're being killed for that, or putting their own safety at risk for that.
You
So
quote
that's
the
really
verse.
where I can come down.
Yeah.
Where-
You quote the verse, أَتَقْتُلُونَ رَجُلًا أَنْ يَقُولَ رَبِّيَ اللَّهِ. You know, are you going to kill someone because he says, my Lord is God? It's interesting what you say, because and you might sense that I, based on your having read very kindly my sort of my book in draft form, I just submitted the second proofs, incidentally. So hopefully, inshallah, it'll be coming out on the 14th of August,
Inshallah.
which is a very deliberately chosen sort of anniversary date, which we can talk about later if necessary. I mean, in a sense, yes, you can prioritize saving your own life, or your own material sort of existence. If I understood correctly, you're saying that that's kind of used as a justification, that, or you're doing it for materialistic reasons. I mean, if you can just re-articulate why you think this happens.
In terms of the Quietists.
Yes, in terms of Quietest, just briefly, because
I
found it.
What they're saying is that, what we're trying to do is preserve the sanctity of the status quo, right? Which includes your own life.
Right.
A lot of the Quietists don't say that it's okay, right? They recognize, a lot of them
Right.
recognize that there is an injustice taking place.
Right.
But what they're
Right.
saying is that we need to place the general stability of the status quo over
Right.
the desire for any kind of change.
Right.
Right.
But
Yeah.
I just wonder. Yeah, I mean, I just wonder, in terms of like, and ideally we'd have someone who's coming from the Quietist perspective presenting their argument in as compelling a form as possible. But I mean, that doesn't preclude the possibility of criticism, right? This is what's really strange. As you mentioned, like, you can't even utter a word against the status quo, or even if it's perceived against the status quo. And this is one of the things that a lot of people were saying after the rise of MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, who notoriously killed Khashoggi in Istanbul. That's only one of the various things he's done, right? I mean, that's what gained the world's attention, but he'd been doing stuff for years that nobody cared about, in a sense, and suppressing people for just sort of... and people would say, actually, you're under threat if you're in the public eye in Saudi Arabia and you're not actively sort of clapping for everything that he's doing. And that's the sort of attitude that these authoritarians generate. For me, what's bizarre is the Quran and the Hadith speak about commanding right and forbidding wrong. The Hadith explicitly says, Sayyid Shuhada'i Hamza وَرَجُلٌ قَامَ إِلَى إِمَامٍ جَائِرٍ فَأَمَرَهُ وَنَهَاهُ فَقَتَلَهُ. Yani, the Hadith where the Prophet is saying that the best of martyrs is Hamza, and a man who stands up to a tyrant, and commands him and forbids him. Yani, he does amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar, and he's killed for it, right? I mean, that's a prophetic virtue. What's wrong with doing that? I think the irony is, of course, that they're saying what they will say is that you don't want to destabilize everything, so the society devolves into sort of like chaos and lots of people die. But authoritarianism precipitates those conditions kind of by default.
Right. And also
yeah.
seeking justice precipitates all sorts as well. It's really interesting. Like you have to imagine how these guys would react if they saw Salman al-Farsi saying to Umar ibn Khattab that we won't listen and we won't obey until you've accounted for the second piece of clothing that you've got around you. Like, could you imagine anybody in this day and age, even in just our masajid in the UK, where there's no threat of like sanction,
right?
But if somebody actually stood up and said, "Hold on a second, I've looked at the balance sheet of this mosque, and I have no understanding of why, there are like 3 houses built in this committee member's name with mosque committee funds, right?
Right.
As we've seen in some places at some small periods of time." That person would be ostracized. There would be all sorts of like ways of like sanctioning him and whatever.
Right.
But the idea that the person who's being questioned should stand and then give a response.
Yeah.
Right. it's completely alien to us now.
What's ironic, of course, is that, you know, this is how power functions, right? Over the last several weeks, there's been this sort of quasi-scandal. I apologize, my children might make some noise, and if that comes, but you know, I have two delightful toddlers in the house, so you know, they make some for exciting times, and to a certain extent, a little bit of disruption, which is welcome as well. So, I mean, for the last few weeks, there's been this kind of like faux scandal, which nobody cares about, ironically, about Boris Johnson and the monies that he's been sort of misappropriating by government standards. And, you know, we're supposed to have this accountable government. We're supposed to have, you know, we're in a democracy. You know, we're supposed to have a media that holds people to account. And, you know, they're sort of quiescent and acquiescent, so to speak. And so, in a sense, you know, this is a problem of power in all circumstances, which is precisely what, you know, the Quran is in some respects encouraging us to sort of hold to account. Is the verse in the Quran that comes to mind is often quoted in its first half by people in you know, tyrannical regimes and scholars in their employ. أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم. I'm sure you know the rest of the verse, right? You know, so obey God and obey His Messenger and those in authority among you, meaning usually understood to be the political authorities. Although the scholars also come into that, and that's an interesting complication. But if you disagree with them, so that's countenanced in the Quran, then go back to God and His Messenger, right? But as you say, you know, there's this sort of attitude of quiescence. Just to come back to your book, and you know, I think the point that your book makes so eloquently really is that the Quran and the Sunnah are themselves resources for us to really think about justice and fight for justice. And if you'll permit me, I'll disagree with you on the point of the tradition not recognizing this, because yes, it's in the Quran and the Sunnah, but you know, the great figures of the tradition, whether it's Ghazali, Ghazali's been so badly misappropriated. I spent half a chapter in my book talking about how this is a gross misunderstanding of Ghazali. But you know, major figures throughout our history are, you know, demonstrably opposed to systems of injustice. This is something which,
I mean, sorry, I was making the point about how Quietists use the tradition,
right,
for their own kind of like
right.
argument. Definitely, you know, that's very much true.
And so I wanted to sort of look at some of the other things that you said, and if you'll forgive me, I'm just pulling up quotes here. No and I'm also sometimes reading this overly theologically, probably. I mean, you may have sensed this based on some of our previous sort of like exchanges on this. But you say part of the strategy of oppression is to sell the dream of a future world in which one day there will be salvation. And part of that is the salvation of the afterlife. So in a sense, you know, the Quietists are, you're suggesting, they're saying, look, you know, the afterlife is coming. That's where all the justice and injustice, you know, the injustices will be solved. There's a Yawm al-Qiyamah, you know, there's a day of judgment, as it were. So don't spend all your energies fighting in this world for things in that way. For me, the question is like, that afterlife also requires Muslims to stand up for justice in this world, right? Like, Muslims in particular should fear the afterlife if they're just going to be quietist in the way that, you know, is stereotypically understood as being promoted. It's only, I mean, I also want to emphasize, it's really only promoted by scholars who are, you know, compromised, unfortunately. The scholars who are not in the employ of the state, they will very often express their disquiet. They might not be particularly activist, but there are plenty of very activist scholars out there as well. So that's kind of my defense of the scholarly traditions.
And I think that, you know, as you said, that, you know, they're compromised in the sense that they're close to power, they're close to government, their positions are maintained through direct employ. I guess my greatest concern is really for those in a scholarly class who see wrongs but feel inhibited by the world that they see to speak. And, you know, the point that I make to them is you know, they run the risk of teaching a narrative of secularism because young people in particular have a very, very, even if they're like, you know, uneducated in the religion, even
Right.
if they're kind of roadmen or whatever, right? Like they have
Right.
a central moral kind of fitri basis that they
Right.
recognize injustice when they see it.
Right.
And so they are also attuned to when there seems to be a dissonance between what an imam is teaching
Right.
and what he's doing, and where he's falling short of the ethics of all of this, the kind of the moral spiritual ethics
Right.
of actions that he's taking. So you
Right.
teach Tawheed, you teach about Allah's Quwwah, you teach stories about Ashab al-Ukhdud, and you know all of these stories, you go through tafsir of them, but
Right.
then you at the same time, when you say stuff like, you know, we're in a weak position, now's not the time to speak about X, Y, or Z, or now's not
Right.
the time to do X, Y, or Z, or
Right.
you know, we just need to keep, you know,
Right.
from causing any trouble for ourselves.
Right.
Those two things are out of congruence with one
Yes.
another.
Yes. Yes.
Because for them, the very notion of Tawheed now is mixed,
Yeah.
right? Like either all Quwwah is with Allah or it's not,
Yeah.
right? And you have to make up your mind about that, because young
Yeah.
people are very smart. They pick up on these things very easily.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
can see for themselves when they feel like somebody hasn't really thought something through
Right.
carefully enough. And so, but the problem with that is that can lead to ramifications for them in terms of how genuine they feel that those who are teaching them the religion are in relation to the religion itself. And that, I think that carries a high responsibility.
I wonder if you've read Yusuf al-Qaradawi, very sort of elderly now scholar based in Egypt, associated with the Muslim Brotherhood historically, but you know, a very well-respected Azhari scholar. Wrote it's been translated in English as he's written a book called Islamic Extremism Between Rejection. The Islamic Awakening Between Rejection and Extremism. So it's a bit of an old book now, but it was reprinted after 9/11 again, and fascinating scholar. He's a well-known scholar, but he basically talks about the fact that, look, all of these compromised, you know, scholars of the Sultan. He has this colourful phrase, "Ulama al-Sulta wa umala al-Shurta," the scholars of the Sultan and the agents of the police, right? Agents of the police state, effectively. And he basically says that, look, you know, these people, in so many respects, are the ones who are driving our youth into the hands of people who really are not good for our youth very often, because our youth can sense the injustices that are so widespread. And so, you know, in some respects, he's basically saying all of these sort of scholars on the payroll of the state, and obviously it's not everyone. There are, you know, scholars who are working within the state institutions who are also very respectable, and who will criticize, you know, sometimes at great risk to themselves. But he's saying that's what, you know, we need to be particularly wary of if we want to sort of have a healthy society and youth who are going to be productive members of our communities and so on. So I mean, I find that sort of component of what you say resonates very much. I'm going to read you another quote, if that's okay. Okay, so, and this is again a situation where it's actually what I'm making more or less the same point, but you know, just to get your thoughts on this. But what does Islam say about the role of scholars with the state? The question is not just academic. It has been central to both resistance and pacification, and is one of and is one that has possibly troubled me more than any other. It can be said almost without doubt that the vast majority of Islam's history has seen a judicial class that has been largely under the authority of subsequent kingships, sultanates, khedival structures, and whatever you may wish to call them. For most of them called themselves caliph, justly or unjustly, and in some respects, a bit of a radical statement in my estimation, but perhaps something we can explore. This, I think, is And you look at the case of Sha'rani, which is really interesting. So do you mind telling us briefly, like, why Sha'rani's work, which I have not read, it's got a very amusing title there, is one which resonated for you in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I came across it by chance more than anything else, really. It's a very short tract which really looks at um, the spiritual ethics of a scholar who has any kind of love of the dunya in their heart, being close or befriending an emir or a sultan or, any kind of person in a position of leadership. And what Sha'rani is saying, mostly kind of quoting his own teacher, al-Khawas, is, if you have anything in your heart that might corrupt you because of your love for the dunya, then having a friendship with an emir is like the worst possible thing that you can do. Like, you are setting yourself up for failure by doing this. I think, when we think about what it means to have a love of the dunya, we have usually a very narrow conception of it, which is around wealth, about the acquisition of wealth. But having a love for the dunya is also simply not wanting to be imprisoned or tortured or harmed in any way as a consequence of your actions. These are all material things, material benefits that we take by acquiescing to the state. We know it in our heart of hearts. That's why people will say stuff to you like, like I get it all the time from people across the whole of the Muslim community. Really like what you do, I'm just a bit worried about publicly associating, right? What they don't understand when they make that statement is that it carries an ethical consequence on the other side of it, right? Potentially, which is, you see something, and you have placed the state and the machinery of the state as a barrier between you and that thing, and we all do it. I do. Okay, and hopefully,
in a sense, you see something as unjust. You're saying you see something as unjust, but because of the, your fear for what the state can do to you, you just keep a distance. Is that what you're saying? It might not even
be the state. It may be your community or your family or whatever, right? But there's something in the dunyawi sense that stops you from saying or doing the right thing. And I think if many of us, including me, reflect on the various moments in our lives where we might have been reticent to say something, then that is important. I do caveat that though slightly, in the sense that I do quote the Hadith of Prophet ﷺ where he talks about hating something in your heart as being the lowest form of faith, but it's still a form of faith. And I think we have to recognize that and remember that. But but there's still.
But to have that as the default is also a problem. I mean, there's a version of the hadith where it says وَلَيْسَ وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ حَبَّةُ خَرْدَلٍ. Like, beyond that point, there's no iman whatsoever, right? I mean, it's.
I did not know that there was another.
So there's a version of Sahih Muslim which is narrated by Ibn Mas'ud, if I recall correctly, where it says, it's actually speaking about sort of, as far as I recall, confronting the state. That version of the hadith. And it says that فَمَنْ جَاهَدَهُمْ بِلِسَانِهِ فَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ وَمَنْ جَاهَدَهُمْ بِيَدِهِ فَهُوَ مُؤْمِنٌ, and then bilisan. So whoever strives against them with their hands is a believer, and whoever strives against them with their tongue is a believer, and whoever strives against them with their heart is a believer. وَلَيْسَ وَرَاءَ ذَلِكَ مِنَ الْإِيمَانِ حَبَّةُ خَرْدَلٍ. But beyond that, there's not even a mustard seed weight of iman. So, it's not a great place to be as your default, even if, in our own time, I think, Muslims do find themselves in a state of abject disempowerment. I mean, and this is one of those other things that kind of comes up. We were talking about, what is religion earlier on, right? You can sort of fight for Palestinian rights in the name of Palestinian statehood, kind of, in the current system. I mean, the problem of settler colonialism is so severe in that part of the world that, it's difficult to even accept that. But should you fight for Palestinian rights because of Islamic solidarity, there's something wrong with you, and you're a threat. And the reality is, it's a different kind of threat. It's a threat to the system, and those sorts of threats are the most dangerous threats, I think. Inshallah, we can potentially explore that more. I wanted to keep on asking you about certain components, but Barakallahu Fikum, this is really sort of, I think there are so many dimensions to this. I want to go on to something, you speak a lot about trauma. So I'm changing gears considerably. And, we're talking about the consequences of injustice. I think you speak quite poignantly about trauma experienced by people going through war and various kinds of injustice, but also the trauma of counterterrorism policing, the trauma of intergenerational sort of PTSD almost, which you give some fascinating and disturbing reflections on the sort of epigenetics related to the fact that apparently sort of trauma can engage intergenerationally. Can you sort of give us a sense of like that impact of the trauma and what it means for us as a society? Like, what will happen if we don't really do things to prevent these things from happening?
Yeah, sure. I think we see a lot of suffering around the world, and I think what's happened with that suffering is we establish these sliding scales of oppression. So, like in my work, I've interviewed a 10-year-old who was tortured alongside his mother to the extent that his guards convinced him that his mother was the enemy, the real enemy, and that his torture was based on her, so that he tried to kill his mother in a cell one night, right?
Oh my God.
So I'm going from that extreme to somebody who's coming and saying, I get stopped at the airport all the time. Or even somebody saying, I got stopped at the airport and it was the most traumatic thing that I've ever been through, right? Now, when we establish sliding scales for oppression, what we say is that this guy who got stopped at the airport once, he just needs to shut up and put up with it, right? Because like there are big things going on in the world. But that is a completely incorrect way of viewing things.
Yeah, those two are related.
Those two are interrelated to one another, because what we're looking at is how all of these systems and structures work cooperatively to allow for all of these things to take place. Now, the guy at the airport is the final product of our collective malaise around dealing with a piece of legislation that we all know discriminates against us specifically. I have never heard of any other community in the UK talk about how they turn up to the airport earlier than the usual 3 hours that is generally recommended before you get on a flight. I don't know any other community that is doing comedic sketches about having pre-prepared answers when you get to the airport and handing over shoes and whatever else, right?
It's true, yeah.
And why are we doing these things? Because we've accepted that there is a different set of rules that we have to be subject to, right? And so we have a collective trauma around this. We joke about it. I've been in so many different Muslim households where somebody will say something and it won't even be controversial, and they'll like knock on the wall and say, just in case MI5's listening, that was a joke. Right?
Yes,
You've been there.
I've been guilty of that many a time. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Why? Because what we've done is we would internalize this idea that we are a watched community. All of these things, these jokes that we make, they're funny for us because it's cathartic when we do it. That dark humor that we've developed. But that dark humor is based on what? It's based on this collective notion that we are being harmed constantly and consistently. But what we're doing is we are normalizing that harm in our lives by accommodating the oppression. By saying, okay, oppression, we will walk around the boundaries of your existence because we don't feel like we can challenge you. Right. And that is the greatest sin for me, from us collectively, that we teeter around the edges of this thing, we'll make fun at it, we'll we'll make jokes about it.
Right.
Sometimes we'll go on Twitter and say, I don't understand why this happened to me. I'm
Right.
one of the good guys. Like, I'm an academic or I'm whatever, right? And not realizing that actually it was never about you in the first place.
Right.
It was always about all of us and what we have collectively accepted as being a normal part of. Sorry, I get very passionate about this topic.
No, that's perfectly. I think that's perfectly understandable. And I mean, the thing is, in some sense, for some people, it might be a kind of coping mechanism, but that coping mechanism, in a sense, as you say, it kind of subtly legitimates, and perpetuates, in a sense. There's this fascinating quote, and I wasn't aware of it. I had a vague sort of inkling of this, where you talked about the British Raj, so the British Empire, in its sort of Indian colony, at no point had more than 0.5% of the population as British, right? And they subdued basically what would have been like one of the largest populations in the world at the time, right? Of any particular region. Maybe China was the only other competitor at the time. How is that even possible, right? Unless everyone is acquiescing, everyone is sort of, in some sense complicit. A colleague of mine at the university has a book called Egypt in a Time of Revolution, so Neil Ketchley, where he basically says that sociological quantitative studies illustrate that you need no more than 5% of a population to have an uprising to completely sort of overthrow a government. Right? There's just no way of the government surviving that, right? Roughly 5%, and so I mean, like, we need to wake up.
It tells you a lot about how we maintain the status quo. Following the book, I thought a lot about being stopped by Schedule 7, largely because the number of stops that I received increased dramatically in the last couple of years before lockdown. Like almost every single time I was coming back into the UK, I was getting stopped and questioned.
How long would that questioning last, incidentally?
Oh, I mean, 2-3 hours sometimes.
SubhanAllah.
And it's such a fascinating experience to have because you have no rights in that moment. I could go outside my house right now, find somebody in the street, beat them to death, and I have a complete right to silence. Even up until the point of a trial. I don't have to speak at a trial if I don't want to. At no point do I have to speak to the police about what I did. Like, at no point is there any legal obligation for me to speak. At a border stop, if I refuse to answer a question, or refuse to pass over the passwords to my devices, I have committed an act of terrorism.
Right. My God.
Just by refusal.
Yeah.
I have zero rights in that circumstance. And what are the questions? The questions are and this is of course the craziest thing about these stops. What they're stopping you for is the legislation is asking whether or not you have been involved with the commission, the preparation, or instigation of an act of terrorism. I've got those three words the wrong way around, but that's what they're asking for. So when they ask me, do you consider yourself a pious Muslim? My own response is always, sorry, but could you explain to me how that has anything to do with whether or not I've been involved in the commission, the instigation, and preparation of an act of terrorism? Right, that's my response.
Right.
Because, your legislation is asking for a very, very specific thing. I want you to explain to me how your question is relevant to that line of inquiry. Right. Most people don't know that. Most people aren't.
Are they stopping you on the basis of knowing exactly who you are?
I mean, they say they don't. They say they don't, of course. But it's possible that they do. It's possible.
I've never been stopped for that long, personally. Right.
I mean, most of the stops are not that long. And what happened is that before they used to log all of the stops, so anything above a 15-minute stop, they would log it.
Right.
And then what happened is that they changed the rules that anything up to an hour they don't log. So when they say stuff like, "Oh well, the number of people we're stopping has reduced significantly," it's because they're managing to get most of their questions out in under an hour, and therefore it's not an official stop. Right. So they play funny sometimes, and for them it's in their interests not to have those longer stops.
SubhanAllah. Yeah, it's sorry, that kind of went down a slightly crazy rabbit hole for me.
Well, I mean, it relates
But
to it
yeah,
because
but
there's only one way to deal with it, which is
yeah,
to refuse to answer questions, to clog up the
right,
system with
right,
hundreds of cases of Muslims from the UK. And
right,
if only, as you said, 5% of
right,
Muslims who travel each year refuse to answer questions,
right.
the courts would be completely flooded
Yeah,
with
yeah,
cases that they would not be able to handle, of people who are just saying, look, we've had enough, we're not answering your questions anymore. We just
right,
refuse,
right.
you know.
Yeah, I mean, subhanallah, you're absolutely right. It's at the same time, like I suspect that 5% of the Muslims in this country, that would be basically something like a million. Sorry, not a million, but something like 250,000, right? If they were to, and and
25,000.
Muslims represent us. Sorry,
I think maybe less than that, probably about 25,000 perhaps.
sorry, 5% of the Muslims. Sorry, okay, yeah, I've
Yeah,
got my
maybe.
numbers a bit mixed up.
I'm terrible at maths, but yeah, I can see that it's more than
Both
25.
scholars in
But
the
it would still be,
humanities.
it
It'll be
would still be
significant.
significant.
Yeah,
It would be a ridiculous number, like absolutely
yeah.
ridiculous. The number, yeah, absolutely.
I mean, at the same time, of course, Muslims are a minority in this country as well. But you're quite right. This system, of course, is set up specifically for this target demographic. So it's not set up for coping with the sorts of scales that one thinks of. But I remember you mentioning in another sort of interview that you gave that at the same time, Muslims need to have a certain degree of political awareness to be able to pull off that kind of a civil disobedience effort, and we're not there yet, in a sense. And I wonder what you think. Like in a sense, what do you see as? So this is kind of broadening onto the question of Islamophobia. So and racism, basically, which is, of course, one of the. It's kind of, I would argue, it's one of the formative components of sort of modern Western civilization. So it's embedded within sort of the discourses of Enlightenment and liberalism and all of those sorts of things. It's part of the reason they went and colonized savages in other parts of the world and engaged in civilizing missions. I wonder, like, as we think about Islamophobia as a Muslim community in the UK, that plays an important role in your text as well. What sort of mechanisms do you see as potentially working towards ameliorating that in the long term? And perhaps this is a good segue to talk about representation politics as well.
Yeah, I mean, like you really touched on the hardest question, right? Because I think ultimately it comes down to how we see ourselves and our long-term ambitions. I don't believe in incrementalist approaches. Just put that straight out there.
Right.
I find no precedents in history to suggest to me that an incrementalist approach to rights has produced a significant enough shift in the structures of oppression and repression to warrant a any kind
The
of
adoption
in
of that, yeah.
yeah,
Right.
in that approach.
Right.
I'm willing to be corrected by somebody.
Sure.
You know, somebody who's travelled a lot and spent a lot of time in South Africa. I haven't seen an end of apartheid there. You know, economic apartheid is very much evident in the everyday of South African lives.
Right.
As somebody who deals a lot with the justice system in America in my daily working life, as well as all of the friends and family that I have over there.
Right.
And of course, you know, how Americanophile our media is. We practically live as an extra state in terms of like how much of America we consume here as British people, right?
We also have plenty of American military bases in this country, so there's that as well.
And so, I haven't seen that incrementalist approach work there either. And over here, I haven't seen an incrementalist approach work as well. If what we're talking about is having equal citizenry, all right? If the conversation, however, is, well, we're just here for a short-term period before we all head back to whichever country we came from, which of course is a ridiculous notion because
Right.
there are many kind of indigenous British Muslims,
And
So I mean, like,
and
this
none
is
of us
really
would fit in back home, so to speak.
right. Absolutely. I mean, like, my culture is, my I always say
As you say in your book,
yeah,
you're as British. You have no problem with identifying in that way. Yeah.
right, absolutely.
Yeah.
So many of my cultural markers are based on that. And so that's it, really. Like, I don't think it's the latter. I think it is a case that if we're serious about claiming, that we are deserving of equal rights in this country, then incrementalism doesn't help us in any shape, form, or manner. What it does is that it delays justice by generations. And if anything, I would say things have gotten worse for us in terms of the cementing of laws and policies that are harmful to us. I think the 90s were better than they are now. Like, where did that incrementalism get us?
I think that's quite transparent and quite obvious in many respects. But I'm still potentially going to push back on some of what you're saying, incidentally. But inshallah, this will be. I mean, this is something which we've kind of had an ongoing conversation on for a few years now, alhamdulillah. But you're right.
Actually,
Ever since we met, absolutely, alhamdulillah. Under the sort of auspices of Ustad Sami Al-Aryan, Jazakallahu khairan. And so, one of the and just on the point of the 90s and the 2000s, I mean, the difference between the 90s and the 2000s, of course, yeah, there was kind of like still a remnant of some serious racism out there, but that just transmuted into, all pervasive Islamophobia after 9/11, right? And that's the sort of ratcheting up since 9/11 to the present, and the sort of ubiquitization, it's not really a word, but I'm inventing it, of Islamophobia as a phenomenon, is just sort of, it's quite terrifying on certain levels when you think, this is the world where you've sort of brought in children, for example, in both our cases, right? And you, alhamdulillah, ala kulli hal. At the same time, so I wanted to sort of like maybe go out on a limb here and ask you about a theological preoccupation I have, which is,
sorry about the noise in the background.
Oh, no problem at all. It's a lively, alhamdulillah, you're in a very lively place. As we, my kids are being very sensible, jazakumullah khairan. As we're sort of talking about, we'll come to the incremental point in a moment, but how do you see, like, the problem of evil, so to speak? Like, how... all of this stuff that we're talking about is very negative in many respects. Does it, is it what does that mean to you? Like, I'd love to understand your philosophical outlook on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I really tackle it in those terms in the book as such. I do talk a lot about the shaitan and him as being kind of his desire to keep us away from Jannah, right? Which, ultimately is leading towards that point, even if I don't necessarily use the word evil and spell out specifically in those terms. But it's a part of our life that we have to contend with. There is evil around us in so many different ways. There's potentially evil inside ourselves as well, in terms of how, to the extent to which we follow waswas, the extent to which we
are willing to acquiesce to the system, without or embrace it, like Korah, Qarun, as you mentioned, like this. You actually, do you mind speaking a little bit about Qarun, like, because I found that sort of narrative section on and the meanings that you took from this figure who is basically a cousin. You put it as a cousin of Musa. He's part kana min qawmi Musa fabagha alayhim. He's part of the people of Musa, but then he joined forces with Pharaoh, right? One thinks of sort of, anyway, like one can think of figures like that in our own time, of course, right? I mean, the current sort of like person who's propping up the Naftali Bennett sort of prime ministership in Israel, for example. One of the figures is an Arab. So I just wonder, I mean, like, if you can reflect on Qarun. I thought that was really profound in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, for me, subhanAllah, I found that whole narrative about these two figures in the Quran. One is the secret believer, who is from the household of Fir'aun, he's from the family of Fir'aun. And some of the Mufassirin say that that Qarun is Musa alayhi salam's paternal cousin. So you have potentially two family members of one from the oppressed class to the Prophet, and one from the oppressor class, you know. And what's interesting, right, this juxtaposition, is that the secret believer is somebody who's close enough to Fir'aun to be able to advise him. You're not going to be in that position where Fir'aun says, I'm going to do such a thing, and this guy turns around and says, well, I don't think you should do it, right? Unless you're close enough to him to be able to do that. He's kind of in his small council.
Fascinating.
So he's in a position of power and a position of authority.
Yes.
Albeit he's secret in his belief.
Yeah.
Right? And then you want Qarun, who is from the oppressed class society, who uses his position in order to entrench the oppression of his own people. To get close to Fir'aun, to gain power, to gain wealth, to gain authority. And when Allah talks about the condemnation of Fir'aun, he talks about his first minister Haman and also Qarun as well. They're named. He's a named person. We would see these kind of obsequious types, you know, these kind of quislings as unworthy of recognition in the annals of oppression and repression. But here is Allah taking this seemingly insignificant person who's just a betrayer, but mentioning him by name. That's the seriousness of his offense, because everybody else is just mala'in, right? That's like bandied together into this, you know, into this term of like, I don't know, people who are advisors or close people. And then you've got like junudihim, right? Like his army, his soldiers. So again, they're all just bandied together. They're the ones who are carrying out the violence, but they're insignificant in terms of being named. Right? Allah names Qarun, as somebody who is going
that's
to
condemned.
Hell. As somebody who's condemned, right? The secret believer, he's praised, even though he's part of the structure.
He's not named.
He's probably not named. Sorry, he's
yeah, you said praised, but he's not named. Fascinatingly, you did.
Yeah, he's not named. That's right. He's not named. But he's praised. Okay.
Yes.
But he's part of the structure of oppression, and I believe that with him, like, I think the story you can take from it, or one of the lessons you might reflect on, because obviously there's a tadabbur rather than tafsir, which I'm very clear about.
That's fair enough.
Is perhaps that you know, if you do get close to power, it's about what you do with that position once the moment comes for you to do something with it. Right. It's not a case that just being close to power is enough. Okay.
Yes.
The secret believer takes the opportunity when it's most needed, when it's most necessary, in order to defend not only Musa alayhi salam, but the whole of Bani Israel, and in fact the whole of the religion. Right. Whereas Qarun is doing the exact opposite. And so the juxtaposition of these two characters for me is like one of the most fascinating when it comes to representation politics. Right? Like, what do you know, Qarun would
So can you outline what representation... Sorry, for the purpose of like viewers who might be unfamiliar with this phrase, can you kind of give us an overview of what you mean by representation politics?
Sure. So representation politics is effectively where you use your status as somebody who is outside of the general norm within society in order to make encroaches within a system in a way that is considered to be like upward mobility, right? So you're either within the political class, or you enter into the police service, or maybe you enter into academia, but just your mere presence within the system and the structure is lauded as a praiseworthy thing, right? And so that's effectively what representation politics, and for me, representation politics is part of, you know, that incrementalist approach. What Booker T. Washington would have called the talented 10th, right? You know, like the 10% of African Americans who, you know, could kind of get into certain fields and could really bring up the whole nation. Right. And for me, the story of Qarun indicates potentially that approach doesn't work. Because ultimately, more often than not, when you get involved in the system, you become a part of the system. You reinforce the system. You acquiesce it. but by
Yeah.
virtue of your presence in it, you allow for injustices to take place against others
Yeah.
because you are used as the excuse for why that can take place, because you are the exception to the rule.
Right. I mean, this is really fascinating, because what you're not saying necessarily that it's not, it's not a good thing to have people who are in the system, but who are, not complicit in the system. You're saying that people who are in the system and are simply perpetuating the system in all its injustices. And you give this, striking example from Naomi Klein's book, No Is Not Enough, I think it's called, where you say, look at, the great first black president of the United States, right? Barack Obama, drone president of the United States, right? Like something like 3,000 to 4,000 people, I think, were killed with drones under his presidency. And I mean, my goodness, like to have that much blood on your hands.
Right.
But this is as Cornel West once said, like, who would ever want to be sort of want to preside over American empire? Like he was asked at one point, would you ever run for president? He's saying, I'm never gonna be the person who has their finger on the button for of American empire, because that system in and of itself is a system of injustice. At the same time, so let's like take the counterexample. I think certain posts are very much like that, and I think Cornel West's point there is well taken. That the US is an empire according to many scholars, right? I mean, I was reading. I think Darrell Lee is a friend of yours potentially, right? I think he gave an acknowledgement, sort of like he name checked you, so to speak. But in his book, The Universal Enemy, which I've just started reading, and really sort of like just a tour de force, really. I hopefully I'll get his contact through you or something like that to get him on this show. But he talks about the fact that really America is an empire, and there are a number of scholars who are writing about this. It has something like 800 military bases around the world, outside of the United States. And so in that sort of a setting, yes, America becoming the president of the United States or the head of the Pentagon, you're basically sort of embodying, you're the embodiment of injustice in a sense. But there are so many other points in the system which, I, as I teach at the University of Oxford, I also point out, look, there's an irony of me teaching at an institution like this, which is really part and parcel of the British Empire, going back hundreds of years. And still celebrates figures like Cecil Rhodes, who was this like, obscene and deeply racist imperialist, and someone who, as with any imperialist, stole and misappropriated vast amounts of wealth from indigenous populations, and killed them with impunity very often. And so, yeah, I mean, but I'm part of that university, and I think there's something important about more of I would say that there's an important role for people of color, for minorities of various kinds, for Muslims, I would say, in the context of the war on terror as well, to be there to express a dissenting voice.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. That's providing you provide that dissenting voice,
Right,
and that's
right.
that's the trick, right? Which is, okay, you're there. Now, to what extent does that position compromise you? And those questions, and I think this is where the Quran comes in, and the ethics of the Quran comes in. Most of those questions you can only answer in a very personal way, in a kind of personal muhasabah, right? A self-accounting of the relationship your heart has to the immediacy of the work that you're doing and your ultimate ambitions. As well, I'm talking about ambitions in terms of in an akhiri sense, rather than a dunya, dunya necessarily, right?
Right.
So that's the point. That's the entire point. That you could be in anything. You could be a football player.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
But because one might argue that that's your rizq.
Yeah.
Right. Like taking that gift that Allah Subhanahu wa Taala gave you to the ultimate point of its excellence. Right. Maybe perhaps somebody might argue that that's what you are intended to do.
Right.
And therefore, you now are in a position where you have all these millions of followers. How do you represent yourself, Islam, in this moment, right? and some people might say, well, look at all these footballers who are holding up Palestinian flags, or
Right.
show.
I mean,
their
there's a
self-
significance to that, right? It gets
Absolutely.
attention into the media,
Absolutely.
and there was a whole discussion a couple of years ago about Mohamed Salah of Liverpool, playing a role in a sense in ameliorating sort of negative attitudes towards Muslims, right?
Right.
And so in a
No,
sense there
absolutely.
can be that, but to a certain
It
extent it's
could be.
almost inadvertent. It's not very conscious on the part of a lot of these people, I think. Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that, but
Yeah.
also there is a case to make as well for our. We know that our actions are judged by Allah Subhanahu wa Taala based on the extent of knowledge that we have.
Of
Right?
course. Of course.
So, you know, you know, one of my scholars once said to me that maybe Malcolm X didn't know the perfection of every single aspect of the furu of the religion, but
Right.
maybe he'll be at the level of the Anbiya, right? For the little that he knew and
Fascinating.
acting upon it.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
Sure,
because
sure.
we don't know, because that judgment, right? Like
Right.
the Sahaba who, literally, I think
Yeah.
something along the lines of becomes Muslim and then
Yeah.
he goes out the next morning and he dies.
Yeah. Actually, on that day, as far as I recall. So a
Right,
Jewish
right.
man came to the Prophet and said, "Uslimu fa'uqatilu or uqatilu fa'uslim?" And he said, "Aslim fa'uqatil." Like, should I accept Islam and then participate in the battle that is basically threatening the Muslim community, or should I participate in the battle and then accept Islam? He said, "No, Aslim fa'uqatil. You should accept Islam and then participate." The Jewish man becomes Muslim. He goes, participates in the battle. He dies a shaheed, and the Prophet says, here's a man, amila kathiran wa ujira kabiran. He did a little bit of action and he got a huge reward, right? He never even prayed, right?
Right, exactly. That's that. Yeah, that's that. I remember. He didn't even pray.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's amazing. And so, maybe that one act, maybe somebody will sign their name to a petition one day after living an entire life of sin, but they do it so much
Right,
ikhlas
right.
that takes them to Jannah, right? We don't
Right.
know.
Sure.
And that's where actually, like, more knowledge, in fact, becomes a more scary thing, which is why we also hold the scholars up to a much higher standard. Because
Absolutely,
the more you
absolutely.
know,
Absolutely.
your complicity and your acquiescence and your closeness to oppression becomes
Yeah.
even more problematic.
Right.
A person who's not knowledgeable about the religion, making mistakes here and there, they're much less of a concern. But when they do something that connects them to the ummah and to Islam and to the love of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala, maybe that act
Right.
done in front of millions of people all over the world would have a consequence and a resonance
Right,
that
right,
none
right.
of us could even match. Right?
And
Right? We don't know.
and the beautiful thing about our tradition is you have these beautiful stories that are narrated. Like there's this story in Bukhari which says "Mumisatan dakhalat al-jannah fi qitta," that a prostitute was nice to a cat once, and because of it she was entered into Jannah, right? So we can't judge, like as I think there's another hadith, don't think of your actions as being insignificant. Like a small action might be worth a great deal.
Right.
And so, I mean, yeah, it's interesting. I have to sort of I spend time sometimes thinking about these things because in Oxford, in a sense, I represent sort of in my department someone who's interested in post-colonial studies, decoloniality, and so on. It's a niche subject sort of specialism almost, but one of the great figures in post-colonial thought, Dipesh Chakrabarty, and his Provincializing Europe, fantastic book, says that the knowledge protocols of the academy prevent the academy from being the center of decoloniality, or from being really a producer. It regiments it. It sort of like categorizes it, and then it's part of that's knowledge. It's not there to be operationalized or realized in any practical sense. And so, yeah, I mean that's a struggle that I think about as well sometimes.
Yeah, and I don't think that a Muslim has the luxury of being caught up in that, and that's where the conundrum comes in.
Interesting.
How do you disrupt from inside these institutions? And that's really like for those of you who who fortunately, alhamdulillah, have these positions, but then unfortunately have to contend with the structures that you are bound by. You guys have a really hard task.
Yeah.
And that's it's one of the reasons why I never wanted to go into academia in the first place. I really stayed away from it. I wanted to remain in the field
Right.
And Cage has always been like the best platform for me
Mm.
to be very, very true about
Right.
all of my beliefs, alhamdulillah, because
Mashallah.
I'm not beholden
Right.
to
Right.
to anybody except for the people that I work with. And alhamdulillah, like, you know,
Right.
I generally work with, I think, possibly the bravest
Alhamdulillah.
Muslims in the UK, you know. And so
Mashallah.
you know, alhamdulillah, it's a real privilege for me. But I would never want to switch places with having a, I don't know, full-time tenured position with an academic in America, because even
Right.
for tenured, right, there are all sorts of restrictions
Right. Right. Right.
through
We-
peer review, through
Right,
kind
right,
of
right.
being at these conferences, through all of this stuff. So how can you disrupt from
And-
inside there? That's a question that
yeah.
you guys will have to answer.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, it's also, you know, I can't remember. My father used to say this. Oh, you know, in our societies, I can't remember who he was quoting, but he was saying, you know, you'll get dissenting voices, but they'll be sort of put in the university, so those cranks can say what they like because nobody listens to them anyway, right? So, and that's, which is one interesting way of looking at it. But at the same time, you know, as we know, a lot of the civil rights activism took place, the anti-apartheid sort of activism took place on university campuses, and it was very disruptive for sort of for those institutions in a way that spilled over into the wider media. And Cornel West, I think, is this fascinating example in the US, Princeton, now at Harvard, who, you know, he said that, look, you know, he's a student of people like John Rawls, like this famous philosopher of liberalism, and he said, but, you know, when the anti-apartheid struggle came, we were all sort of like basically taking over and engaging in an occupy, what was effectively an occupation of the department. You know, all the students coming in and demanding that he speak and address these sorts of questions. I'm saying this from memory, but you know, that I think there are ways in which it's a challenge. I mean, I personally think that, and this is a conversation we've been having for a while, I think you can seek kind of like purity of cause and context, but often have limited impact, and you can seek sort of participation in the system, and the system is designed to absorb any sort of impact that you're trying to have on it. Right. And, you know, it's in my perspective and my view, basically, you know, we need people trying every different method that is available, because hopefully at some point certain efforts will stick, and there should be that symbiotic relationship between these various efforts. Allahu
Yeah,
a'lam.
I mean, I don't disagree with that at all. I think my only response to that is having, when we make decisions about efficacy, or we make shura about something, whether or not an act is effective, it has to be long term. We have to be able to try and predict the consequences of that 15, 20 years down the line.
Right.
If we, for example, look at the short-termism of the MCB, for example, and others turning up 10 Downing Street after 7/7, many of us, including me, would say, like, it was an important moment for the Muslim community to be present.
Right.
But what they signed up to in the short-termism of that moment,
Yeah.
right, which is a narrative around terrorism and counter-extremism, whatever else, which
Right.
really was cemented in that moment.
Right.
You know, 20 years down the line, we're seeing the real effects of that. Okay?
Right.
We're seeing the
Right.
effects of that in all of our spaces, and now the latest manifestation of the consequence of that moment is that our students can't talk about Palestine without getting expelled, without getting detentions, without having their political
Right.
ambitions.
Right. Right.
kind of
It's incredible. I
in
mean,
so
this is.
many ways, right?
I've never
And I'm not saying
heard
it's
of that
causally
happening
linked.
before. Yeah.
I'm
I
not
mean,
saying it's causally linked, I'm
is there
saying-
any precedent for that happening at the school level? I've just not heard of this before. This just, you know, and Gavin Williamson, basically, the current secretary or education minister, basically underlining that, yeah, this is with our support, this kind of suppression of effectively free speech
Right.
in a quote-unquote liberal society is taking place with
No, I
the
mean,
full
I think
support
the
of
last
the
time
state.
something like this
Yeah.
happened was ironically during the apartheid era. You know?
Right.
So,
Or McCarthyism in the United States that you talk
Right.
about. Yeah.
and so, and of course, at the same time, there's a culture war being fought to protect certain types of freedom of speech of
Right.
racists and
Right.
Islamophobes,
Right.
right?
Right.
So
Right. Right.
there's
Right.
this, it you know, it just shows you how the situation that we're currently living in is so badly
Yeah.
rigged, and that ultimately is my point in the book, right? Which is, if you see the structure of oppression as a whole edifice, rather than concentrating on individual small aspects of it, then you have a better understanding of the beast that you're dealing with.
Yeah.
But what happens is that we get worried about citizenship deprivation of Shimon Begum for a very, very short period of time, but then we forget that actually there are hundreds of other people that are being affected by it. Or we get very angry about Prevent, or we get very angry about Guantanamo Bay. But
Right.
all of these things are interconnected. They're part of the same edifice.
Right.
And so because we don't look at the edifice of oppression and repression, we constantly end up reinforcing, you know, the system itself. And I think that while we do that, we're never going to, you know, be able to, you know, shift anything
Right.
anything
Right.
meaningfully in terms of the dial. But also because there's a lot of husna dhan for government.
Right.
I just got to say it as it is. Right. The level of husna dhan that we give our
To the government. Right.
and policymakers
Right.
and
That's fascinating. yeah.
securocrats is like, it's unprecedented. Like, we do not
For-
extend
for-
this level of
yeah,
husna dhan to any Muslim, to any
Right.
scholar, to nobody. Like, it's just like, it's
For
crazy.
those who might be unfamiliar with the phrase husn al-dhan, it means like having a good opinion of, you know, the intentions of a certain individual, or in this case the government. And I yeah, I don't know if it's from my parents, but I was always instilled with a sort of a deep sense. I mean, this is ostensibly a liberal value as well, of course, but it's rare to be seen these days, of skepticism towards those in power, right? But you know, it's fascinating. We live in this state of exception that I haven't read Agamben's book, but you quote sort of this Schmittian idea. I'm going to continue a bit on this theme. I mean, you talk a lot about this, you know, the Muslim moderate, so to speak, or the liberal lawyer, and you know, Martin Luther King's critique of the moderate voice, so to speak. He speaking about the white moderate, and some of this stuff. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. is now celebrated in the US. He gets his own day, but if anyone read his work, they'd be like, "Get rid of this day immediately!" Right? But it's fascinating how you know, the system can appropriate an individual. A racist system can appropriate a anti-racist to his core and dilute the message that he gave.
I mean,
To such an extent.
Yeah,
sorry.
Harris's book, A More Beautiful and Terrible History, does such an amazing job of showing how the history of Martin Luther King, and more importantly Rosetta Scott King and Rosa Parks, was co-opted
Right.
by a liberal narrative. It's
Right.
an excellent piece of scholarship.
What's her name? Sorry.
Jeanne
his-
Theo Harris.
Oh,
and it's
sorry.
called A More Beautiful and Terrible History.
Right. You might have it on your shelf. Okay, I have to read that, inshallah.
No, it's excellent. And I
Yeah.
recommend it to everybody.
Yeah.
And it's so fascinating because I've been in situations before where, and
Yeah.
this has happened so many times I can't even begin to recount, where literally people say,
Right.
you know, we see Cage as like a Malcolm X model and the
Right.
MCB as a Martin Luther King model. And I'm like, what the hell?
You've not read anything, have you?
I wish Cage was more like, was even at Martin Luther King level.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Because this was a man who's willing to go to prison for his
Right,
beliefs.
right.
Who was willing to actually disrupt and boycott and put his safety and,
Right.
you know, his life and his freedom on the line.
Yeah. And the moderates hated him for it.
Yeah, and the
Yeah.
moderates hated him for it. Like, you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
we are not even close to that level
Yeah.
of organizing.
Yeah.
Like, to say, I mean, you know, the MCB has done some amazing work over the years, so I'm not out here to just like slag them
Sure.
off unnecessarily,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
But to
Yeah.
equate what they're doing to a Martin Luther King model of dealing with a repressive structure,
Right.
is you know, and even to equate Cage to Malcolm X, I think it's completely disingenuous. You know, Martin Bright did it. He wrote this whole thing where he compared us to the Black Panthers, and we actually laughed at it. We laughed at that article
Right.
because we are nowhere near that level of organizing that comparator could ever be made.
Yeah.
You know, and so it's
Fred Hampton.
What we do is
Yeah.
we co-opt that history in ways that
Yeah.
actually are used to disenfranchise us.
Right.
You know,
Right.
Martin Luther King was not a pacifist in the sense of somebody who just worked inside the system. That was not his approach.
Right.
You
Right.
know, and the, you know, the brains behind his operation, which is Coretta Scott King, was far more radical in her approach.
Fascinating.
She's the one who teaches Martin Luther King about the political positioning, his views on the Vietnam War. You know, you don't, you know, that was informed by her. You know,
Right.
taking this strong stance against the military. And what we've got is
Right.
institutions, mosques and Muslim institutions signing up to the military here in the UK now. Like, we are
Right, right,
very
right.
far removed from that tradition, if that's
Right,
what
right.
we're going to make comparators with.
I wanted to read a quote from him that you have in your book, and I wanted to read a few of these quotes. I mean, this is the quote from Martin Luther King, but it's just quite striking. And this is the Birmingham sort of jail letter, so to speak. And that Birmingham jail letter is written specifically to, I think, a group of white ministers. You know, Martin Luther King was himself a minister, who were saying, look, you know, we sympathize with your cause, but you're doing it wrong. You know, you're too radical, right? And he says, as you quote, first, I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counsellor or the Ku Klux Klanner, which I assume sort of the white citizen's counsellor is similar to the Ku Klux Klan in terms of being an extreme white supremacist group, but the white moderate. So he's saying the main stumbling block is the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice.
I mean, that
this
narrative reminds you of everything you wrote about in your book.
stuff.
You know, no, but
It-
like really, right?
yeah,
What
yeah.
he's saying. that
It does. I mean,
the preservation
yeah.
of security over
Yeah.
justice.
Yeah. Let me actually, you know, this is actually one of the points that comes later in my book, because what's ironic, of course, is the people who say that are perpetrating gross sort of insecurities, so to speak. So David Kirkpatrick, a New York Times journalist who's written, I think, the best book on Egypt, on the Egyptian Revolution and the Arab revolutions more generally. It's called Into the Hands of the Soldiers, published in 2018. He basically points out that, look, you know, they said we needed to get rid of Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood from, you know, in the coup of 2013, because Egypt was kind of falling into instability and violence and all of these sorts of things. And he actually looks at the numbers, and just the sheer number of military personnel who've been killed, alongside, of course, the amounts of murders that the military themselves were perpetrating, goes up, you know, exponentially after that 1 year when the Muslim Brotherhood were, you know, obviously sort of they didn't do a great job, and it was a very difficult situation in power. But in 2013, so I, you know, thank you for plugging my book. I talk about this there, and you know, this is the narrative of the scholars, of course, the very, you know, I almost want to use scholars in inverted commas there. Like Ali Gom'a, who gets one shout out in your book, so to speak, who is this really sort of this scary Machiavellian character in Egypt, who's, you know, still actually active in public life. He's someone who aspires to become the Sheikh al-Azhar, which is the holy grail of sort of public office for a Muslim scholar in Egypt. And he celebrates the massacring of these people. He basically says, look, you know, to justify the massacring of, you know, anti-coup protesters, pro-democracy protesters in Egypt, he says that, you know, we had to get rid of the President Morsi because it was creating too much instability and it was creating fitna. And so we want to bring about stability. The instability of Egypt has been there to witness for everyone, you know, in the years that followed, and the number of people who died in their thousands was far exponentially greater than the number of people who died in the year of Egypt. So even those calls for sort of what King calls a negative peace, the absence of tension, is hardly the absence of tension. There's intense animosity. It's just the silence and the repression of black voices and their acquiescence to abject injustice, which is what is being called a negative peace. And a positive peace is the presence of justice.
And where the right moderate comes into this is, I mean, I think you can replace that with liberal moderate instead in the context that we're in. Is, you know, this preservation of a respectability in the way, this seemingly respectability in the way that you carry out and conduct yourself in public life. You know, and so I posit a theory in one of the chapters around liberal complicity, where effectively I'm saying that the people who are closest to the violence in terms of suffering the violence of the state are the least complicit. If they have to use an inadequate system to get their rights, like, no one can judge them for that, because they have an immediate task at hand, which is to get their rights back. And in that sense, you know, their families are going to do whatever it takes for their loved one to get their rights, even if it's inadequate, you know. And so, like, the civil rights activist in me would be like, don't engage in the system. Don't seek rights from a system that is fundamentally racist and flawed and whatever. But the human being in me understands that this person has a family, they have a life, they just want to get back to normal. And so they're least complicit. The people who are most complicit are the ones who, as you get further and further away from the violence, you know, will say things like the lawyers who will say, well, we need to challenge the system, but we can't do it with X, Y, or Z case. Right? We can't do it with this person, he's too brown looking, or his beard is too big. Can you find us a non-Muslim, and I've heard this many times in many legal offices, can you find us a non-Muslim who's been affected by this legislation so we can challenge the legislation itself, right? Yeah. And, you know, ironically, that's nothing new. People think of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was not the first person to have sat on the bus. There were 2 women before her who had done a similar thing, but their causes weren't taken up because there were some issues that the activists at that time had around the morality of their backgrounds, or their kind of economic status, or their kind of public perception around them. So this idea that you have to have the perfect victim in order for people to understand, and the perfect victim actually is often non-Muslim.
Yeah, well, I mean, but this is where I want to sort of you know, we've had this discussion as well in the past briefly, that at the end of the day, if you have an end goal where you want to get rid of justice, you know, get rid of the injustices, ideally you want a perfect system at the end of it. In practical terms, you're not going to get that, right? I mean, الدنيا قفص المؤمن وجنة الكافر, as the hadith says, like, in a sense. But, you know, and this is where I was basically saying that something along the lines of incremental change, where I can understand the mentality of the liberal lawyer, as you put it in your book, who says, you know, can we have a non-Muslim to front this case? Because they want to have that incremental change, because they, from their perspective, it's like, look, these systems are so entrenched. If you're going to bring that case with, you know, something which doesn't play to the prejudices of the system itself, which is, you know, there are racial prejudices embedded within it. There are prejudices about, you know, women in hijabs or whatever it is. Then present it, you know, I know that you also mentioned the MCB in this connection. You were saying, you know, you didn't. I don't know if you didn't refer to them as the MCB. You said the biggest Islamic organization. I understood it to be the MCB, so I'm gonna say that, if you'll forgive me. But you know, saying something along the lines of, you know, we like your idea, but, you know, why don't you get a non-Muslim or something along those lines to front that idea?
It was a report that I wrote. They liked the report, but they suggested that maybe it would be better being fronted by a non-Muslim.
And I understand your indignation with that, but that indignation, I would argue, is not acknowledging their strategic reflection on, look, you know, it's an acceptance of less than an ideal outcome, right? It's an acceptance that, look, we live in a situation where what we want to do is ameliorate to whatever extent that's possible. There's no question that 50 years ago, if I was a brown person in the UK, things would be a lot worse. And
I'm perfectly fine with that. I'm perfectly fine with that. But don't pretend like the injustice doesn't exist, which is where my problem lies, right? So what happens is that they play this game. Fine, you want to be strategic. If that's what we're calling strategy, let's just assume that's strategy, right?
Sure.
But in your public narrative, then And it's not just them. I'm talking generally here, right? When you present this idea that everything is rosy, that actually we don't really live in difficult times, that actually there's just a few problems here and there, and that actually the system works. It's okay. People are getting along. They're getting along just fine. That's where the problem comes in. Be strategic. Absolutely. I have no problem with that. I have no problem with people being thoughtful about how they carry out their activism. I have a huge problem with a presentation that is hypocritical, especially for our communities and especially for young people. I think young people deserve much better than to be sold a lie about the world that they live in. I don't think it's right to sell them that lie. And that's just my personal view on the matter. Like maybe other people might disagree, but I don't think it's right to give an impression of living in a world that just doesn't exist.
I mean, it's part of the, you could describe it as a kind of liberal triumphalism about the modern world, which says, look, we're really living in the best of all possible worlds in many respects. And, that is, I think, flagrant deception, very often a self-deception. It's something that a lot of liberals I know will believe, with great conviction. But unfortunately, it's a bit of a dream world in my estimation. I'm conscious of your time. I really appreciate the amount of time you've given. We actually do have a question, but so we'll address that question. But thank you from Aman actually, which is I don't know if you can see the question. I'm going to put it on the screen, but I'm not sure. I've not read it properly yet. So I think it's about literature. Okay. So Aman Muhammad is saying, I'm Aman from Ethiopia. Dr. Asim Qureshi, how do you think literature, especially fiction, will play a role for Muslims in understanding the secular world around them, with authors like Kamila Shamsi? I'm not familiar with Shamsi's work, but I know you read a lot more literature than I do.
Her Home Fire was excellent. I really enjoyed that book a lot, especially because she predicted Sajid Javed in her character of Quran alone before Sajid Javed actually became Home Secretary. I mean, it was like, A'udhu Billah, but it was almost prophetic in its accuracy. It was unbelievable.
Fascinating.
I actually tweeted,
which book is this?
Home Fire.
Home Fire, right.
It's actually it's a very, very, very good book.
Okay.
Yeah, definitely worth reading. I mean, I had some issues with it, but that distracts from the general politics and meaning that you
That's fine. I mean, I think I need to spend a lot more time in fiction, and I've noticed that you've given sort of book podcasts in the past, or on YouTube actually, which I've thoroughly enjoyed, and you've recommended some fiction as well. So
yeah, I mean, my response to Aman is that definitely I think fiction is such an amazing tool to getting across very, very important ideas. I recently wrote my first kind of fictional novella, which inshallah I'm hoping to see if I can get published somewhere.
Inshallah.
But, yeah, we'll see. But in terms of just like not just around secularism, I think almost any idea can be conveyed so effectively through fiction, because it just like opens your mind in ways that that otherwise I think more academic texts or non-fiction texts don't sometimes get those messages through. I think my one concern about fiction is that whole idea of representation politics comes in, where just the fact that you are a Muslim author who's writing fiction becomes the ultimate ethic in and of itself. And sometimes the level of Islamic symbolism or moral within the book are just non-existent. Like, I've seen kind of, fully bearded Muslims and, hijabi Muslim sisters who are authors talking about, well, I'm just an author. Like, why is there an expectation? But ostensibly they're being promoted on the basis that this is a practicing Muslim who is publishing works. Now, if you're going to use the persona of Muslim and Islam to sell your wares, then I personally believe that comes with an obligation to inject some of our morals into that conversation. It comes back to that conversation about representation politics. If you want to say that this is a completely secular book, has nothing to do with my religion, my faith is not...
Then don't market it as a Muslim.
Like the fact that I wear a hijab or I have a beard that's down to my knees, right, has nothing to do with this, and I'm not going to use my religion as a marketing tool, then that's fine. Go ahead and do that. Like, knock yourself out. But as soon as you use Islam as an
Interesting.
identity marker to
Yeah.
brand yourself, I think that comes with responsibility, and I think we should be aware of that when we do those kinds of things.
That's fascinating. I mean, it's a fascinating way of sort of, I think, conceptualizing that, and I think that, you know, a couple of countervailing considerations perhaps are that, you know, being in the secular context we are, a lot of people won't feel confident talking about their sort of religious personas, and in a sense, you know, they would feel sort of like possibly tripped up, especially in certain types of more hostile media when it comes to religion. And so, in a sense, for those sorts of people, marketing it as a Muslim sort of author would seem to be shooting oneself in the foot if you're that uncomfortable about that aspect of it. But
Sometimes it can.
yeah. But I mean, like, we're in such a sort of secular, especially Western Europe, I think, particularly sort of a secular context where, you know, religion in the public sphere is sometimes seen with a degree of hostility almost. I mean, I lived in the US, and in the academic space, I felt very much like I was in sort of like Western Europe. But I know in the wider public space, you know, that religion is actually part and parcel of American society. So yeah, it's a different kind of vibe there. But again, it has to be a certain type of religion. So, you know, the type of religion that actively calls for social justice, that's fine for the black churches, I think. I'm not sure it's as common in, you know, if Muslims were to do those sorts of things, I think it would be frowned upon,
Right.
or
But as it
much
was,
worse, of
as it
course.
was,
Yeah.
you know, as it was.
Yeah.
That's where the surveillance really helped to depoliticize our masajid in so many ways.
I want to give you the last couple of minutes, before, you know, before we sort of conclude around 8ish. But I really appreciate, you know, this has really been a wonderful opportunity to have a chat about things that we've, you know, really wanted to have a chat about actually, for a while. So I want to thank you. But if any closing thoughts, aside from the fact that everyone should buy the book, please do. Sort of, there's a link going to Cage directly, and I'm sure it'll also be an excellent way to support Cage. I think that
Yes, absolutely.
we didn't talk about the work that you do in as much detail as I would have liked, actually. There's a comment which is coming in the last minute. Do you mind if I read it out, or can
Yeah,
I?
sure, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So Fatima Barakatullah, thank you for joining. Jazakumullah khair. Says, do you think many of us grow up with a learned subliminal inferiority complex? And in your experience, how can we overcome it if we identify signs of having internalized this? Oh, tough question. It's going to
Yeah,
require
it's a
more.
tough question. Yes. I think that's a hard one. I think we all do in different ways. You know, my wife, she always asks me why are you apologizing all the time, right? As somebody who refuses to condemn, I have this like very British habit of saying sorry about everything in almost every place that I'm ever in.
That's a great
Even when
excuse.
yeah, well, I mean that really is my British side.
You're
Now,
British.
is that
Yeah.
is that an inferiority complex as much as it is my culture that I have not adopted, that I've grown up with, that is entirely the culture of the place that I come from. You know, British people constantly and consistently apologize for things. I think that is slightly different, perhaps, than having an inferiority complex. I think the world around us creates that at times because we're a minority, and this is nothing unique to us. I think wherever you have minority communities, you have this desire to want to be accepted by the majority in different ways. I think my father has a bit of a rebellious streak, and so we grew up not so much with an inferiority complex. We were, you know, alhamdulillah, sent to one of the best schools in the UK,
Mashallah.
which also gives you, you know, my parents worked very hard to send us there, which kind of also gives you this almost like arrogance that, you know, like you don't feel less than anybody else in whatever
Public
situation.
education, public schools do that.
Yeah, it does, right? It does.
Yeah.
And so, like, we internalize that. Like, even if I wasn't performing my studies, I never felt like I was less than anybody else in any given space at any given time. And
Right.
I think we were encouraged not to feel arrogant about it, but to not feel like we were less than anybody at any place. And that was nurture. That was nurtured into us, you know, not only by our parents, who made us feel confident, but also by the schooling environment that we were in. But of course, you can have a negative experience. I was bullied in school. I had plenty of negative experiences for me in my upbringing. It set me back in certain ways. But so there are all sorts of things that are going on constantly in our lives, and it's often difficult to predict. I mean, one thing I will say is that the main confidence that I got from being able to publicly speak and to really just operate in the public full stop was actually only when I started practicing Islam. Before then, I had no confidence whatsoever to do public speaking. Like, I had general confidence, alhamdulillah, but not to do public speaking. But really, once I started practicing Islam, it's something, I don't know, just, overcame that completely. I don't know what it was, but alhamdulillah, it really, I can definitely root it to that moment. So, yeah, I think it's a difficult question. And in terms of overcoming it, I think having a strong relationship with the Quran and understanding that, and an understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's quwwah, it reminds me of Imam Ahmad saying, when he, at the height of his torture, he was asked, like, how were you able to overcome it? And he said, I looked at the sword and the whip, and then I thought about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's majesty and just like the immenseness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it was like those things faded into nothingness for me, right? And it's something so profound that when you situate whatever you're going through in your life, when you situate whatever moment that you're in within the context of understanding la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah, right? You get a completely different frame of thinking about whatever difficulty you're going through, because you know nothing and no one can have any greatness over Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that might seem abstract, but as somebody who has been through some difficult moments in his career, being harangued by the media and whatever else, I can honestly tell you, having something like the Fajr, right? Being able to put your head on the ground and think about the magnificence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it's an absolute game changer, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guide us and keep us,
Ameen.
On his faith, because really without him we're nothing, subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Ameen. Jazakumullah khairan. And
I
think that's a beautiful point on which to end. I just want to highlight that this also is a wonderful illustration of the quintessential British public school educated boy, so to speak, being so deeply spiritual in secular Britain. Really, I think, indicates what Britain will potentially become in the future, as there are more people like ourselves. Like, for yourself or myself, our religion isn't some sort of private affair that doesn't inform every aspect of our lives. Rather, it does precisely that, and it's a source of solace in a very concrete way. You mentioned this might seem abstract, but I don't think for most Muslims who listen to what you just said that would seem abstract, because they know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is part and parcel of their every moment. Inshallah, I mean, it's something that we need to constantly remind ourselves. But Jazakumullah khairan for that. That's really a beautiful reminder and a beautiful point on which to conclude. Jazakumullah khairan. I just want to also let viewers know that next week, inshallah, I'll be speaking to, and Dr. Asim Qureshi, Asim Bhai, please do feel free to tune in if this is of interest. But Abdullah al-Awda, the son of Salman al-Awda, I'll be discussing his father's book, As'ilat al-Thawra. It's an Arabic book, but we'll be discussing in English, inshallah, the questions of revolution, one of the texts on the basis of which he's probably been imprisoned. But he's probably been imprisoned because he's, such a voice for justice in a country like Saudi Arabia. May Allah sort of liberate him from his unjust imprisonment. And inshallah, please do join in a week's time. But with that, I want to really thank our for doing a 2-hour marathon session with me, my dear and beloved brother Asim Qureshi. Inshallah, I look forward to seeing you in person after a long time, once the lockdown finally ends. بارك الله سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.